The day Eli Carver rode into Harlan's Creek at full gallop, the dust rose behind him like a war cry, and every man, woman, and child within earshot pressed themselves flat against the nearest wall. That was simply how it had always been. Since the summer of 1878, when Eli Carver had first come tearing through the valley on that black and white paint horse of his, a great, wild-eyed animal the locals had taken to calling Phantom. The very sound of hoofbeats approaching too fast had become a kind of warning bell for the people of Harlan's Creek, Nevada. Not that Eli was a violent man in the truest sense of the word. He had never drawn iron on a civilian, never robbed a stagecoach, never put a bullet into anyone who had not first tried to put one into him. But there was something about the way he moved through the world reckless and untethered, like a storm that had forgotten it had somewhere to be, that made people instinctively step aside. He was 31 years old and built like the desert itself, lean and sun-hardened, with dark hair that curled at the collar of his worn leather duster, and eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over the Sierra Nevada. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of sandstone, and a mouth that rarely smiled, though when it did, the effect was somewhat disorienting for anyone standing close enough to witness it. He had ridden courier for the army, scouted for cattle drives, and once, though he rarely spoke of it, worked as a deputy marshal for a short and eventful season in the Arizona Territory. He had quit that last post because the marshal he served under had turned out to be a man of severely compromised character, and Eli Carver had never been good at looking the other way. Now he did odd jobs. He carried messages for the Wells Fargo office in Reno. He brought supplies up from the railhead when the mountain passes were too treacherous for slower wagons. He moved fast and he moved alone, and the people of Harlan's Creek had long since accepted that this was simply the nature of the man. He blew through town like a hot wind, useful, occasionally necessary, but never comfortable to stand directly in front of. On the morning of the 14th of April, 1879, Eli came through town faster than usual. He had a pouch of letters strapped to his saddlebag that were already 3 days late on account of a washed-out bridge near the Peavy River crossing, and he was in no mood to dawdle. He came down the main road at a dead run, Phantom's hooves throwing up clods of dry earth, the sound ricocheting off the false-fronted storefronts like rolling thunder. He had done this 100 times. The road would be clear. It was always clear when he came through like this, because the people of Harlan's Creek had learned. He was nearly past the general store when he heard it. Not a shout, not a scream, just a small, clear, entirely unhurried voice cutting through the roar of hoofbeats and rattling leather. "Excuse me, would you please slow down?" Eli's hands tightened on the reins before his brain had fully registered the request. Phantom, who was as attuned to his rider as any animal Eli had ever known, responded to the pressure with immediate reluctance, pulling back from a gallop to a canter, then a trot, then, as Eli turned in the saddle to find the source of that voice, finally stopping altogether in the middle of the road. Standing at the edge of the boardwalk in front of the general store was a woman he had never seen before. She was small, genuinely small. Not the kind of small that people describe to be polite, but the kind of small that made you wonder for a moment how she managed to take up so much space. She could not have been more than 5 feet and 2 inches in her boots, and she was wearing a plain cotton dress of dark navy blue with a white collar, her dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a bonnet that had seen better days. She was carrying a large basket of dry goods against one hip, and with her free hand, she was holding onto the sleeve of a small boy who appeared to be about 5 or 6 years old, keeping him pressed safely behind her on the boardwalk. Her expression was not frightened. That was the first thing Eli noticed, and it struck him with an odd force, because fear was typically the first thing he saw on people's faces when he came through like this. This woman looked at him with something closer to mild annoyance mixed with patient expectation, like a schoolteacher waiting for a student to come to the correct answer on their own. "You nearly knocked over my son," she said. He stepped off the boardwalk just before you came around the corner. We are perfectly fine, but I would ask that you consider the people around you when you ride through town." Eli stared at her for a moment. Behind him, he was vaguely aware that several townspeople had emerged from wherever they had flattened themselves, and were watching this exchange with considerable interest. "I apologize, ma'am," he said, and he was surprised to find that he meant it fully without qualification. He removed his hat, which was not something he typically did when speaking to strangers. "I didn't see the boy." "No," she agreed, looking up at him without flinching. "That is generally the problem with riding that fast." Then she shifted her basket, reached down to take her son's hand properly, and walked back into the general store as though the most feared rider in the valley were not sitting in the middle of the road with his hat in his hand, staring after her. Eli sat there for a long moment. Then he looked down at Phantom, who had taken the opportunity to lower his great head and sniff at a patch of dried grass at the edge of the road. "Not a word," Eli told the horse. He delivered his letters. He stopped at the Wells Fargo office and signed his receipt. He tied Phantom outside the Dusty Bell Saloon and went inside to get a whiskey and a piece of whatever the kitchen was offering that day, which turned out to be beef stew that was mostly beans with aspirations. He sat at his usual table near the back wall and he ate, and he thought about nothing in particular, and he absolutely did not think about a small woman in a navy dress who had looked at him like he was a problem to be politely corrected. He asked the barkeep, almost as an afterthought, whether he knew the woman. The barkeep, a heavy-set man named Grover who had been running the Dusty Bell since before most of the current population of Harlan's Creek had arrived, leaned on the bar and considered the description. "Auburn hair, small, dark blue dress," Grover said. "That be Cora Rourke, widow, moved into the old Hendricks place out on Sage Creek Road about 4 months back. Her husband passed, Thomas Rourke, I think his name was. Good man by all accounts. Some kind of fever took him up north somewhere around Elko, left her with the boy and not much else from what I understand." Eli absorbed this information in silence. "She buy land out here?" he asked. 40 acres, Grover said. "Dry as a bone right now, but she's been working it. Hired the Navarro brothers to help her put up a fence line last month. People in town have been keeping an eye on her, see that she's all right. She's quiet, keeps to herself mostly, but she's polite as anything." He paused, then added with a slight emphasis that Eli chose to ignore, "Real direct, though. Doesn't dance around things." "No," Eli agreed. "She does not." He finished his stew, left a coin on the table, and told himself he was done thinking about Cora Rourke. He managed to maintain this position for approximately 3 days. He was riding the ridge road that ran along the eastern edge of the valley on the morning of the 17th when he looked down and saw, on Sage Creek Road below him, a wagon that had lost a wheel. It was sitting at a severe angle in the ruts of the road, tilted hard to the right, and beside it stood a woman in a navy dress and a boy in overalls, both of them contemplating the situation with what even from a distance looked like considerable composure. Eli told himself he would have stopped for anyone. This was true. He was not a man who rode past trouble if he was in a position to help. It was one of the few absolute principles he operated on. He turned Phantom down the slope and came down to the road at a careful, measured trot, because he was still thinking about what she had said to him outside the general store 3 days ago, and there was something in him that did not want to give her any further cause for complaint. He pulled up beside the wagon and swung down. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, reaching up to touch the brim of his hat. She looked at him with that same direct, unhurried assessment she had given him before, and a small crease of what might have been surprised recognition appeared between her brows. "You are the man from the road," she said. "Eli Carver," he said. "I ride courier for Wells Fargo. I can see you've lost a wheel. If you have the spare, I can have it on in about 20 minutes. She studied him for a moment, and he had the distinct impression that she was conducting some kind of rapid and thorough internal audit of his character and intentions. "I have the spare," she said at last, and something in her voice shifted just slightly, not softer exactly, but something. "The jack is under the seat." "I would be grateful for the help, Mr. Carver." "Eli," he said. She paused. "Eli," she agreed. The boy, who had been watching Eli with enormous brown eyes from beside his mother, chose this moment to speak up. "That horse is very big," he announced. "He is," Eli agreed, crouching down to the boy's level. "His name is Phantom. Would you like to pat his nose?" The boy looked at his mother. She nodded. He looked back at Eli with a gravity that seemed almost too large for a 5-year-old's face. "Yes, please," he said formally. "His name is James," Cora said, watching as Eli led the boy carefully to Phantom's nose. "He is 5. He is very serious about everything." "I can see that," Eli said, and he found himself smiling, actually smiling, as Phantom dipped his great head obligingly, and James reached up with both hands and placed them flat on the horse's velvet nose, with the expression of someone completing a deeply significant transaction. Eli fixed the wheel. It took him 17 minutes, which was 3 minutes better than he had promised, and when he was done he stood and wiped his hands on a rag from his saddlebag and found Cora watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "Thank you," she said. "I would offer you coffee, but I am afraid I am already late getting back, and I have James's supper to think about." "Think nothing of it," he said. "The road gets rough just past the second bend going east. Take it slow through there. The wheel may need to seat itself properly before you push it hard." She tilted her head slightly. "You mean I should slow down?" There was the smallest trace of something in her voice, not mockery exactly, but something dry and warm and self-aware that it took him a second to identify as humor. He felt the corner of his own mouth lift. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I suppose I do." He watched the wagon until it had gone around the first bend and out of sight, and then he stood in the road with the spring sun on his face and the red earth stretching out around him, and thought that Harlan's Creek was perhaps slightly more interesting than he had previously given it credit for. Over the following 3 weeks, Eli found himself riding past Sage Creek Road with a frequency that, had anyone bothered to notice it, might have seemed difficult to explain purely on the basis of professional necessity. He delivered a letter to the rancher named Dawson, who lived a mile past Cora's property, which required him to ride directly past her gate. He investigated a report of a downed fence that turned out to be nobody's fence in particular, somewhere in the general neighborhood of the Eastern Valley. He stopped once to water Phantom at the creek that ran along the back edge of her land, which was also, technically, public water. He saw her twice from a distance, once hanging washing on the line in back of the small white-painted house, once walking with James along the fence line with a notebook in her hand, making some kind of inventory. He did not stop either time. He told himself this was out of respect for her privacy. He told himself this for approximately 12 days before the truth became impossible to ignore, which was that he was afraid. Not of her, not precisely, but of the feeling that had started up in his chest that morning by the wagon on Sage Creek Road, a feeling that was warm and inconvenient and entirely unwelcome given that his life was built on speed and solitude, and the easy freedom of never staying in one place long enough to matter to anyone. He had been in love before. Or something adjacent to it. There had been a woman in Prescott, Arizona, in the summer of 1876, a merchant's daughter with red hair and a laugh like a struck match, who had told him plainly that she could not build a life around a man who was always on his way somewhere else. She had been right. He had known she was right even as he rode out of Prescott for the last time, and the knowledge had not made the riding any easier, but it had not stopped him either. He had decided, somewhere along the long road between Prescott and the present, that love was simply not a territory suited to his particular way of traveling through the world. And yet, he was at the Wells Fargo office on a Wednesday morning when Henry Marsh, the office manager, sorted through the latest incoming mail and placed a small parcel and a sealed letter on the counter. "Delivery for Mrs. Rourke out on Sage Creek," Henry said. "The regular boy has a broken arm, fell off a fence 3 days ago. I don't suppose you're going anywhere near that road in the next day or two. Eli looked at the parcel. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, with careful handwriting on the outside. He looked at the letter beside it, which bore a return address from a town in Oregon he did not recognize. I can take it today, he said. He rode out to Sage Creek Road in the late afternoon, when the sky was turning that particular shade of hammered gold that the Nevada desert did in the hour before sunset. He came to the gate of the Rourke property and found it standing open, which struck him as slightly unusual. He rode up the lane slowly. He had been riding slowly, he realized, ever since that morning outside the general store, at least in and around the valley, and stopped the horse in front of the small porch. Cora came around the side of the house, from the direction of the small barn. She was wearing her work clothes, a gray skirt and a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her hair was coming loose from its pins in the way that happens when a person has been working hard for several hours. She stopped when she saw him, and then she came forward, wiping her hands on a cloth tucked into her waistband. "Mr. Carver," she said, then remembering, "Eli. Henry Marsh asked me to bring these out," he said, holding down the parcel and the letter. "His regular delivery boy is laid up." She took them from him, and her fingers brushed his briefly in the passing, and he looked away at the western horizon and told himself that the warmth in his face was due to the setting sun. "Would you like to come in?" she said. "I have coffee on. James is inside. He'll want to tell you about the horse book he found in the church's lending library." He should have said no. He had a delivery to make in the morning, and he needed an early start, and there were 100 sensible reasons why he should touch his hat, say good afternoon, and ride back to town at a reasonable pace. "I'd like that," he said. "Thank you." He tied Phantom to the porch post and followed her inside, ducking slightly through the door, and found himself in a small, neat interior that held a surprising amount of quiet dignity given its modest dimensions. There was a table set for two with a third place for James's smaller dishes. There was a bookshelf beside the fireplace with a serious collection of volumes, more than he would have expected. There was a watercolor painting on the wall beside the window, a landscape of mountains and a river, executed with considerable skill. "Did you paint that?" he asked. She was at the stove pouring coffee. She glanced at the painting. "My husband did," she said. "Thomas was talented with a brush. James has inherited that, I think." She said this with the particular quality of a person who has made a very complete peace with their grief, not a person who doesn't feel it anymore, but a person who has integrated it into the fabric of their life so thoroughly that they can speak of it plainly without fracturing. "I'm sorry for your loss," Eli said. "Thank you," she said simply. James appeared from behind a door that led to what was probably the bedroom, holding a large illustrated book with the focused expression of someone delivering important documentation. "Look," he said, presenting the book open to a page of horse illustrations. "This one looks like Phantom, except this one is all black. Phantom has white here." He pointed to the patches on the illustration with authority. "That's true," Eli said, sitting down in the chair James indicated. "Phantom has more white than most paints. It's what makes him easy to spot from a distance." "Is that good or bad?" James asked seriously, sitting down across from Eli with the book. "Both," Eli said. "Depends on who's looking." James considered this with the expression of someone cataloging information for later use. Cora brought the coffee and sat down at the table, and for a while they simply talked about horses, because James required this, and then about the land, because Cora had questions about the soil quality on the eastern section of her property, and whether the creek ran reliably through summer, and who she might talk to about the possibility of irrigation. She had, Eli realized as she spoke, done a great deal of thinking about this land and what it might produce. She was not dabbling. She was not simply surviving, she was building something. "Where did you come from?" he asked her, meaning geographically, not intending anything indelicate. "Vermont originally," she said. "Thomas and I came out together in the spring of 1874. We tried to make a go of it near Elko for a few years, and it was going well enough, and then he got sick." She paused, turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "I sold what we had there, what there was to sell, and I came south. I wanted land that was mine properly, something James could grow up knowing as home." "Vermont," he said. "That's a long way." "Yes," she said, and smiled slightly. "Everything out here is a long way from something else. I've found that I don't mind it." He rode back to town in the dark, later than he had intended, with the stars enormous overhead and the desert cooling rapidly around him in the way it did after sunset. He rode at a moderate pace, which was to say not slowly. He was still himself, and Phantom still had opinions about being held back, but not the flat-out, ground-eating gallop that was his default. And he thought about a woman who had come a long way and built something careful and deliberate out of grief and dry earth, and about a small boy who wanted to know whether being easy to spot was good or bad, and about a coffee cup turned slowly in brown, capable hands, and he thought that perhaps the territory he had decided love was unsuited to had shifted its borders somewhat since he had last checked the map. He went back the following Wednesday, and the one after that. He brought supplies from the general store on Henry Marsh's behalf on 2 occasions when the delivery schedule was disrupted. He helped Cora with a section of fence on the north side of her property that had come down in a late spring storm, spending an entire Saturday afternoon driving posts and stringing wire, while James supervised with great seriousness from a safe distance. He brought James a book about the Rocky Mountains from the small lending library at the Harlan's Creek Community Church, because James had mentioned the mountains 3 times in 2 conversations, and Eli had judged this to be significant. He did not, through any of this, say anything approaching what was actually happening in the large, quiet space behind his ribs whenever he was near Cora Rourke. He was still a man who moved fast, even if the moving had slowed somewhat in the immediate area of Sage Creek Road. He was still a man who was more comfortable with open horizon than with walls. He had no house of his own. He rented a room above the Harlan's Creek hardware store from the owner, a man named Garrett, and had occupied it for 2 years without acquiring anything that could not be packed in 10 minutes. He had no land, no savings to speak of beyond what was in his working account with Wells Fargo, and no particular promise of permanence. He did not feel that he had the right to say anything to a woman who was already doing the difficult work of building a permanent life out of temporary materials, when everything about him suggested impermanence. It was Cora who eventually made it impossible to continue in this fashion. It was an evening in late May, a Thursday, and he had ridden out on no pretext at all, just ridden out, which they had both tacitly agreed to acknowledge as a normal thing that happened, even though no particular acknowledgement was ever made. James had gone to bed early, worn out from a morning helping with the small kitchen garden Cora was developing along the south wall of the house, and Eli and Cora were sitting on the porch in the blue evening air, and she had brought out a lamp in her mending, and he had his back against the porch post and his hat on his knee, and the creek made a small constant sound in the darkness below the ridge. She set down the mending and looked at him with that direct, unhurried gaze of hers and said, "Eli, I need to ask you something." He looked at her. "Are you intending to keep coming out here," she said, "for reasons that have nothing to do with Wells Fargo business?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I thought so," she said. She looked out at the dark ridge for a moment. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it plainly because I think plain is the only way I know how to do things." "Go ahead," he said. "I like you being here," she said. "James likes you being here. You are good and you are kind and you are a great deal more thoughtful than the reputation that precedes you would suggest." A pause. "But I am not a woman who can afford to be confused about things. I have a child and 40 acres of dry land, and a roof that will need new shingles before winter, and what I cannot manage is uncertainty. So if you are coming here because you feel something, I would rather you say it than ride back and forth on that ridge until one of us goes gray. The The last sentence contained a distinct trace of that dry, warm humor he had come to listen for, and it loosened something in him enough that he could speak. "I feel something," he said. "Good," she said. "So do I." He turned his hat over in his hands. The stars were extremely bright. "I should tell you," he said, "that I'm not a man who has been particularly good at staying." "I know that," she said. "I'm telling you honestly, not to be discouraging. I'm telling you because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort." She was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," she said. "And I'll be honest in return. I'm not asking you to stay. I'm asking you to consider whether you want to. Those are different questions." He thought about that for a long while. The lamp flickered between them. A coyote called somewhere in the middle distance and was answered by another farther away. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have been moving fast for so long that I forgot to notice what I was moving past." Cora turned to look at him, and in the lamplight her eyes were very dark and very steady. "And what are you noticing now?" she asked. "You," he said. "Mostly you." She held his gaze for a long, honest moment, and then she did something he had not expected. She reached across the short distance between them and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee, and the warmth of it went through him like the first day of real summer after a long cold. "Then I think we are on the same road," she said. He turned his hand under hers and held it, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And the coyotes called in the dark, and the creek ran, and the lamp burned down slowly between them, and it was by some distance the best evening Eli Carver had ever spent in the state of Nevada. He rode back to town later than usual, at a trot rather than a gallop, and did not feel the loss of speed at all. What happened next was gradual in the way that only the most permanent things are gradual, not slow, exactly, but thorough. Like the way water works on sandstone over time, not dramatic, not sudden, but leaving something fundamentally changed in its wake. He began to stay for supper on Thursdays, then on Saturdays as well. He helped her with the roof before the end of May, spending 3 long days up on the pitch with a hammer and new shingles from the lumber yard in town. And Cora brought up lemonade and stood below shading her eyes and telling him when he had missed a nail, which was not often, but which she commented on each time anyway with a precision he found deeply charming. James brought things up to the roof on a rope and pulley system of his own devising, which worked better than it had any right to. There was an afternoon in June when they rode together out to the eastern edge of her property, James on a borrowed pony from the neighboring Garfield Ranch, and Eli showed her the section of creek bank where the water ran deepest through summer, and where the land looked like it might hold moisture better than the rest if she diverted it right. He had been thinking about her irrigation question for weeks and had asked around, talked to a man named Aldridge who farmed out near the next valley and had done something similar, and he laid out what he had learned carefully, watching her face as she listened, watching the way her brow creased slightly when she was processing a difficult piece of information and smoothed out when she had absorbed it. "You researched this," she said, looking at him. "I had time," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "You did not have time," she said. "You made time. That is not the same thing." He was quiet. "Thank you, Eli," she said, and the way she said it was not the polite, reflexive thank you of social obligation. It was the kind of thank you that is actually a statement of something larger, of being seen, of being regarded with care, of mattering to someone who had clearly chosen with great deliberateness what they were going to allow to matter to them. He reached over and tucked back a strand of hair the wind had pulled loose from her pin, and she let him, and James, who was 20 yards away investigating something in the grass with scientific intensity, did not look up. There was a complication in July. His name was Dale Whitmore, and he arrived in Harlan's Creek on the 4th of the month, aboard a bay gelding that had clearly been ridden hard, which was the first indication Eli had that Whitmore was the kind of man who used up the things around him without thinking much about their capacity. Whitmore was a land speculator, or at least that was how he described himself to anyone who asked, which in Eli's experience was a job title that covered a wide range of activities, not all of them straightforwardly honest. Whitmore had papers, he said, showing that the land the Rourke property occupied was part of a larger parcel that he had purchased from an estate in Sacramento, and that Cora Rourke's deed was in error. He presented this claim at the Wells Fargo office one morning while Eli was collecting his route assignments, and when Eli heard the name Rourke mentioned, he went very still and then turned around slowly. "What's this about?" he said. Whitmore looked at him with the slightly offended expression of a man who was used to being deferred to. He was perhaps 40, heavy in the chest and shoulders, with a broad, florid face and the kind of easy confidence that tends to sit on men who have rarely been told no by anyone they considered worth listening to. He told Eli what he had told Henry Marsh, that Mrs. Rourke was in occupation of land that legally belonged to him, that he intended to file a formal claim with the land office in Carson City, and that he was extending the courtesy of advance notice before proceeding, which he clearly felt was a generous act on his part. Eli looked at him for a moment, then looked at Henry Marsh, then said, "She bought that land through a legitimate transaction from the Hendricks estate. I was present when she filed the deed." This last part was not strictly accurate. He had not been present exactly, but he had seen the deed and knew it to be properly registered. He said it anyway with the particular calm authority of a man who is very comfortable making statements in a confident tone of voice. Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly. "And who are you to her?" "A friend," Eli said. The word felt, even as he said it, like it was about 3 categories short of accurate. He rode out to Cora's that afternoon and told her about Whitmore. She listened without interrupting, sitting at the table with her hands flat on the wood, her face doing that thing it did where it became very still and composed, which he had learned to recognize as the face she used when things were serious and she needed all of herself for the thinking part. When he was finished, she said, "My deed is properly registered. I have the papers." "I know," he said. "But paper disputes can take time to sort out, and a man with money can make a legal claim drag on long enough to cause real problems even if he's wrong. I want to help you if I can. Would you let me look at the papers?" She got them from the box she kept under the bed. It was a solid tin box, carefully organized, which told him a great deal about her, and spread them on the table, and they spent 2 hours going over them together while James slept through his afternoon nap. Eli was not a lawyer, but he had, in the course of his work, seen enough deeds and land claims and the disputes between them to know what a clean title looked like, and hers was clean. The registration number was in order, the metes and bounds were properly described, and the notarization was from a legitimate county office. "I'm going to ride to Carson City," he said. She looked up. "Eli, there's a land office there with records going back to the territorial period. If Whitmore has any claim at all, it will have to be registered against your deed, and I want to see exactly what he's claiming before he has time to do any maneuvering. It's a 2-day ride and I can be back by Friday." She was quiet for a moment. "You would do that," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. She studied him with that dark, level gaze. "I told you I don't need rescuing," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not rescuing you. I'm going to get information that you can then use however you see fit. You can come with me if you'd rather." A small pause. "James can't travel that fast," she said. "Then I'll go and bring you back what I find," he said. She was quiet for another moment, and then something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but opened like a door moved slightly ajar. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He rode to Carson City the next morning, pushing hard but not the way he used to push, not the flat-out oblivious gallop of a man with nothing to lose by going fast. He was thinking about what he was riding back to as much as what he was riding toward, and that was a new feeling, and he paid attention to it the way you pay attention to something you are not sure you have ever felt before. The land office in Carson City was a stout brick building on the east side of the main commercial street, staffed by 2 clerks who had the exhausted, ink-stained air of people who dealt all day with the complicated and often contentious business of who owned what in a state that was still in the process of figuring itself out. Eli presented Cora's deed number and asked to see the relevant parcel record. What the clerk brought back was instructive. Whitmore did have a document, an old one, dating from 1871, before Nevada had fully systematized its land recording. But it was imprecise in its boundaries, used measurements that were since obsolete, and more importantly, the Hendricks estate from which Cora had purchased had clear, uninterrupted, properly registered title going back to 1873, post-dating Whitmore's document and superseding it under the terms of the Nevada Land Act Amendments of 1875. The clerk confirmed, in the dry, authoritative language of people who have explained this kind of thing many times, that Whitmore's claim was not only legally inferior, but almost certainly fraudulent in intent, that it appeared to be a pattern the land office had seen before, in which speculators used old, ambiguous documents to bully recent landholders into settling for cash, rather than face the cost and uncertainty of a legal fight. Eli thanked the clerk, got a certified copy of the relevant records, and rode back toward Harlan's Creek with the documents in his inside coat pocket, and a clean, settled feeling in his chest that had a great deal to do with the fact that he would be able to give Cora something that meant her land was safe. He arrived back the evening of the second day, the sky turning rose and amber to the west, and rode straight to Sage Creek Road without stopping in town. Cora heard Phantom on the road and came out onto the porch before he had reached the gate, and the look on her face when she saw him riding up, not anxious, not dramatic, just present and attentive and quietly glad, hit him somewhere just below the sternum with a force that took his breath slightly. He spread the documents on the table and explained what the clerk had told him while Cora read through the certified copies with concentrated attention, and when she had finished, she sat back in her chair and let out a breath that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh but somewhere in between. "Whitmore's claim is worthless," Eli said. "He knows it too, probably. He's counting on people not knowing enough to push back." "He picked the wrong woman," Cora said, and there was nothing boastful in the way she said it, just a quiet, accurate statement of fact that made Eli want to smile until his face hurt. "He did," Eli agreed. She took the copies to the sheriff's office the next morning, accompanied by Eli, and presented them to the sheriff, a steady man named Holt who had been in office for 6 years and who took the matter seriously, called Whitmore in, and had what Eli understood was a clear and definitive conversation with him about the nature of his supposed claim and the various legal and personal consequences of proceeding with it. Whitmore left Harlan's Creek 2 days later and was not seen in the valley again. After that, something shifted between Eli and Cora. Not in quality, the warmth and the ease and the something more than friendship had been there since that night on the porch, but in openly acknowledged direction. They stopped pretending that his visits were about anything other than wanting to be in the same place as each other. She stopped qualifying things with phrases like, "when you're next passing through," and he stopped leaving at an hour that was reasonable rather than the later hour that was actually honest about how much he did not want to go. One evening in August, sitting in the kitchen after James had gone to bed, she asked him about his life before Harlan's Creek. She asked with the same directness she used for everything, but with a gentleness underneath it that made him feel that she was not asking out of curiosity, but out of care. He told her about Prescott. He told her about the marshal he had worked under and what had happened there. He told her about the years before that, moving from job to job and place to place, and about his father, who had been a difficult man in the ways that difficult men frequently manage to be, cold and critical and deeply convinced that tenderness was a variety of weakness. Cora listened to all of this without interruption, and when he was done she said, "You have been running from the idea that staying somewhere means giving something up." He looked at her. "Maybe," he said. "What I think," she said carefully, is that you have been moving so fast that you have not been able to tell the difference between freedom and loneliness, because they feel similar when you're in them, especially on horseback." He was quiet for a long time after that. "You are very perceptive," he said at last. "I am not particularly perceptive," she said. "I have just been watching you carefully for several months." There was a warmth in that statement that he could feel radiating outward from its center. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him hold it and looked at him with those dark, steady eyes that he had come to think of as the most completely honest eyes he had ever looked into. "I don't want to be moving so fast that I miss this," he said. "Whatever this is." "I know what this is," she said. "So do I," he said. "I just needed to say it out loud." She smiled then, really smiled, not the small contained curve she usually allowed herself, but a full, genuine smile that changed her whole face and made the kitchen feel suddenly lit from several directions at once. He kissed her for the first time that evening, leaning across the kitchen table in the lamplight, and she kissed him back with the same direct, unhurried quality she brought to everything, and it was precisely as profound as he had suspected it would be. September came, and the valley turned from gold to amber to the deep, clarified copper of early autumn. The days were still warm, but the nights were cold and sharp, and Eli found himself spending more and more of his time on Sage Creek Road, and less time in his rented room above the hardware store, which he had begun to regard with the same mild detachment with which one regards a coat that has served its purpose and might reasonably be retired. He had a conversation with himself about this. It was the kind of internal conversation that requires a long ride and honest thinking, and he took it seriously. He considered his options, and he examined his feelings from several angles, and he thought about what a life that included Cora Rourke and James Rourke, and 40 acres of dry Nevada land, and a creek, and a kitchen, and a roof that no longer needed new shingles would actually look like from the inside, day after day, without the option of riding out whenever things became difficult. He thought about it for about 2 hours, and then he stopped thinking about it, because what he had found at the end of 2 hours of rigorous examination was that the only thing he was actually afraid of was asking the question and finding out that her honest answer was no. He asked Sheriff Holt, because Holt was the kind of man whose counsel he respected, and because he had no family near enough to ask, whether he thought Cora Rourke was the kind of woman who would want a husband who had a complicated history, and no fixed property and a horse who had an attitude. Holt looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things in his time, and finds this particular one both comprehensible and mildly amusing. "You're asking the wrong person," Holt said, "but I'll tell you what I know. She is careful, that woman. She thinks things through. She doesn't go in the direction of things that aren't good for her. If she's been letting you come around as often as the whole town has noticed you coming around, that tells you something about what she thinks." Eli considered this. "The whole town has noticed." "Son," Holt said, with great patience, "Grover at the saloon has had a standing bet going since June about when you were going to ask her. The pot is currently $12.40. Eli went to the general store and bought a small silver ring from Mrs. Calloway, who kept a modest selection of jewelry in a glass case beside the dry goods. It was a simple thing, a plain band with a small twisted detail around the outside, but it was solid and real, which was the quality he was looking for. Mrs. Calloway wrapped it in a square of blue velvet without asking any questions, which he appreciated. He rode out to Cora's on a Saturday evening in October with the ring in his coat pocket and Phantom, moving at a collected, purposeful trot that seemed to reflect the occasion. The aspens on the hillside above the creek had turned gold and were dropping their leaves in slow, spinning cascades whenever the wind came through, and the air smelled of wood smoke and cold water and dry grass. He found her in the kitchen garden, doing the last of the autumn harvest, her sleeves rolled up and her hair loose under her bonnet. James was somewhere in the barn. The light was coming from the west at a low, golden angle, and it caught in her hair and along her cheekbones, and he looked at her for a moment before she heard him, just looked at her and thought, "This is what I was moving past. All those years of fast and far, and this is what I was riding through without stopping." She heard him and looked up and smiled. He came through the garden gate and stood in front of her, and she read something in his face. She was good at reading his face, had become very good at it over these months, and went still in the particular attentive way she had. He took out the velvet square and opened it. "Cora," he said, and his voice was steady, which he was grateful for because the rest of him was not entirely so. "I am not a man who has given people very many reasons to believe in his staying power. I know that. But I also know that I have not been truly going anywhere since I rode into this valley, because everything worth going toward was already here, and I was too fast to see it until you asked me to slow down." He paused. "I would like to marry you if you'll have me. Not because you need me, I'm under no illusion that you need me, but because I want to build something here with you, and I think that given the chance I could be a man worth building a life beside. If you're willing to tell me when I'm being an idiot, which I expect you would do anyway." Cora looked at the ring in his hand and then at his face, and her own face was doing something complicated and transparent and entirely at odds with its usual composure, which made his heart beat very fast. "That is the most honest proposal I have ever heard," she said, "including the first one." "Is that a yes?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "That is absolutely a yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it, and then she came forward and put both hands on his chest and looked up at him, and he put his arms around her and held on in the way you hold on to something that is real and present and not going anywhere. And for the first time in a very long time, neither was he. James came out of the barn and regarded the scene with his customary seriousness and then said, "Are you going to live here now?" "If your mother will have me," Eli said. "I said yes," Cora said, to James rather than to Eli. James considered this with his great 5-year-old gravity, and then nodded as if ratifying a decision that had already been made through processes he approved of. "Good," he said. "Phantom can live in the barn with Daisy." Daisy was the small bay mare that was currently stabled on the Garfield Ranch on loan until Cora could arrange her own stable situation. "They will be friends." "I think they will," Eli agreed. They were married in the Harlan's Creek Community Church on the 8th of November, 1879, on a morning that was cold and clear and blue, with a frost on the ground that caught the early light and threw it back in 1,000 small points of brightness. The church was not large, but it was full, which surprised Eli and seemed to amuse Cora, who had predicted it. "You have been riding through this valley for a year and a half," she said, while he helped button the back of the dress she had made for the occasion, a deep green wool with cream lace at the collar and cuffs. "People are curious about you. They always have been. They just were not sure how to approach the subject while you were doing 60 miles an hour." He laughed, which was a thing he found himself doing with growing frequency these days, and she looked over her shoulder at him with that full, illuminated smile. Sheriff Holt was there. Henry Marsh from the Wells Fargo office was there with his wife, a cheerful woman named Agnes who had brought an enormous pie. The Garfield family from the neighboring ranch were there. Mrs. Calloway from the general store, who collected the jewelry pot from the back shelf, was there, along with what appeared to be most of the town. Grover from the Dusty Bell Saloon came, looking uncomfortable in what was clearly his only dress coat, and handed Eli an envelope containing $12.40, which he had evidently decided to donate to the occasion rather than distribute to the various parties to the bet. "Put it toward the fence line," Grover said gruffly, and shook Eli's hand. The Reverend was a small, earnest man named Bright who had been conducting services in Harlan's Creek for 3 years, and who married them with a simplicity and sincerity that Eli found he was grateful for. He looked at Cora during the words and she looked at him, and what passed between them in that look was more complete than anything he had words for and did not require them. James stood at the front beside them, gravely holding the small bunch of dried autumn flowers that Cora had prepared for the occasion. And when Reverend Bright pronounced them married, he looked up with an expression that finally, for the first time in Eli's acquaintance with him, cracked into a proper 5-year-old grin. It was so sudden and so purely delighted that Eli felt the back of his throat tighten unexpectedly. After the ceremony, there was food laid out in the churchyard despite the cold, because Agnes Marsh had organized this with the same efficient thoroughness she brought to everything. And there was warm cider and the enormous pie and several other contributions from various members of the assembled population. Eli stood with Cora's hand in his and received the congratulations of the valley, and thought that it was a peculiar and wonderful thing to be embedded in a community you had previously been moving through too fast to feel. An older man named Callum Webb, who had been in the valley since before it was a proper town, found Eli near the edge of the churchyard and looked at him with sharp, appraising eyes. "I used to say the day Eli Carver stayed put would be the day I ate my hat," Webb said. Eli looked at him. "What are you eating these days?" he asked. Webb gave a short, delighted laugh. "Wedding cake, it turns out," he said, and went off with his piece of Agnes Marsh's pie. The first winter of their marriage was also the winter Eli moved his few possessions from the room above the hardware store to Sage Creek Road, which did not take long given the stated policy of keeping only what could be packed in 10 minutes, though he found as he packed that there were now several things he was not prepared to be quick about. A book Cora had lent him, and that he had read twice. A drawing James had done in church one Sunday, a picture of Phantom with a small figure on top, labeled, in careful kindergarten letters, Eli. He packed these things carefully and he did not rush them. He kept his Wells Fargo route for the first winter, because the income was necessary, and because he was not yet sure what shape the rest of his working life would take. But he came home every evening, which was something he was not sure he had ever been able to say before, and the coming home part of each day was revelatory in the way that only ordinary things experienced for the first time can be. The lit window from the road, the smell of something warm on the stove, the sound of James running to see if Phantom had come up the lane with him, which was usually a yes. He had a conversation with Cora in January about the land and about money and about what they might build together. It was the kind of conversation that requires two people who are both practical and honest, and who trust each other enough to say the difficult numbers out loud. And they had it at the kitchen table over the remains of supper with a lamp between them, and at the end of it they had a plan. Not a grand plan and not a perfect one, but a solid, workable one. The 40 acres, the irrigation he had researched, a small cattle operation to start, modest enough to be manageable but with room to grow if the land cooperated. Eli knew cattle. He had driven enough of them north and south over the years to understand their requirements and their tendencies and what a reasonable small operation needed. He knew men in the valley who could advise who had done similar things. "I will need to stop the courier work eventually," he said. "Not immediately, but eventually." "I know," she said. "Take the time you need." "It won't be long," he said, and was surprised to find that he meant it. Spring came back to the valley with the usual excess of Nevada enthusiasm, one day still cold, the next warm enough to bring the first tentative wildflowers up along the creek bank. And then suddenly, fully, irreversibly warm, the way spring in the high desert always arrived, as if it had been waiting just around a corner and decided all at once that waiting was over. Eli had reduced his Wells Fargo route to twice a month by April, and by June he had given it up entirely, which meant a conversation with Henry Marsh that turned out to be genuinely kind. Henry said he was glad for him, and that the office would find another writer, and that he hoped Eli knew the Wells Fargo job had always been a holding pattern for a man who had more capacity for rootedness than he had given himself credit for. Eli thanked him and meant it. He threw himself into the work of the land with the same focused intensity he had previously applied to movement, and found, to his mild surprise, that he was genuinely good at it. Not in the instinctive way that some men were good at farming because they had grown up in it, but in the methodical, problem-solving way of a man who approaches every new territory with careful attention and a willingness to be wrong and adjust. The irrigation channel they dug that summer, with the help of the Navarro brothers who had helped with the fence the previous year, brought water to the eastern section of the property for the first time, and the change in the ground within 3 weeks was visible and remarkable. Cora worked beside him, in the way she worked at everything with a quiet, steady thoroughness that he had come to regard as one of the finest things about her. They did not always agree. She had strong opinions about the northern grazing rotation that differed from his, and he had thoughts about the fence maintenance schedule that she felt were overly optimistic, and they argued about both things with the direct, affectionate candor that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. He liked arguing with her. She was extremely good at it, and she was almost always at least half right. James turned 6 in April and 7 the following April and grew with the quiet, serious steadiness of a child who was taking detailed notes on everything the world offered him. He had inherited his father's artistic eye and spent many of his spare hours drawing horses mostly, but also the mountains to the west and the creek, and the small herd of 6 cattle that had arrived in the autumn and that he had named comprehensively and without being asked. He called the largest steer Admiral, which Eli felt was both inaccurate and perfect. He had started calling Eli Pa by the 3rd month after the wedding, with no announcement or ceremony, simply deploying the word one morning over breakfast as if it had always been the arrangement. And Eli had had to excuse himself briefly to attend to something in the barn that turned out not to require his attention at all. The year 1880 turned into 1881, and Harlan's Creek grew a little and changed a little in the way small towns grow and change. A new dry goods annex added to the general store, a schoolhouse built on the edge of town in which James enrolled in the autumn with the expression of a person embarking on a serious professional undertaking. Eli found himself increasingly embedded in the life of the town in ways that would have seemed implausible to the man who had been blowing through it at a gallop 18 months earlier. He served on the committee that oversaw the schoolhouse construction. He attended meetings of the Valley Cattlemen's Association, where he was listened to with more respect than the relative newness of his operation would strictly have warranted, on account of his demonstrated practical knowledge. He helped Sheriff Holt with a situation involving a small group of men who had been moving stolen horses through the Southern Pass in October, not because it was his job, but because Holt had asked and he was the best rider in the area, and the situation had required someone who could move fast across difficult terrain. He moved fast when it was needed. He simply no longer moved fast when it wasn't. The people of Harlan's Creek adjusted their understanding of him with the philosophical pragmatism of people who have been surprised before and expect to be surprised again. The man they had once pressed themselves against walls to avoid became the man they waved to on the road. Grover at the saloon still told the story of the wedding day envelope, which had passed into local legend with the characteristic embellishment of retelling, and which by 1881 involved a bet pool of $23 and some kind of dramatic scene that bore very little resemblance to the quiet handshake that had actually occurred. In the spring of 1881, Cora told him, one evening in the kitchen with James already in bed and the lamp burning warm between them, that she was going to have a child. She told him in her usual direct way, without preamble or ceremony, and watched his face with those dark, attentive eyes, and what she saw there made her smile slowly. He got up from his chair and came around the table and pulled her up and held her carefully, and she put her face against his neck, and he stood there in the kitchen with his arms around his wife and thought about how a man's life can be transformed utterly by a single moment of being asked, kindly but firmly, to slow down. Are you happy? She asked against his collar. "Cora," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "I'm the happiest I have ever been in my life." She pulled back enough to look at his face and apparently found the evidence convincing. "Good," she said, and kissed him in the simple, direct way she had that still managed after a year and a half of marriage to stop the world for the length of a breath. The pregnancy was in most respects an ordinary one, progressing through the summer and into the autumn with the steady reliability that characterized Cora's approach to most undertakings. She did not slow down her work. This was a matter of considerable discussion between her and Eli in July, when he suggested that perhaps the heavier parts of the cattle work might be temporarily delegated, and she informed him with characteristic patience that she was expecting a child, not suffering an incapacity, and that she was fully capable of determining which tasks were appropriate for her condition. He subsided. He was, he had learned, most useful to Cora as a practical partner and genuinely committed husband, and least useful when he veered into the territory of assuming she needed managing. He had made that mistake exactly once in their marriage, and she had corrected it so gently and so completely that he had simply never done it again. He was, however, vigilant in ways that she could not object to, making sure the heavier equipment was always close to hand, so she did not have to carry it far, riding into town more frequently, so she had no need to take the wagon over the rough road, learning to cook 3 dishes beyond the eggs and beans and coffee that had constituted his pre-marriage culinary range. He made a beef and vegetable stew that James declared was almost as good as his mother's, which was high praise from a 7-year-old who took the evaluation of food very seriously. The child was born on the 17th of December, 1881, on a night when the temperature had dropped below freezing, and the stars were so clear they looked close enough to touch. The midwife, a capable and unsentimental woman named Mrs. Dowd, who had been delivering babies in the valley for 12 years, arrived by 8 in the evening, and Eli spent the hours that followed in the kitchen with the stove burning high and James asleep in his room, listening to sounds from the bedroom and feeling, for the first time in his adult life, the specific and profound helplessness of being someone who loves deeply in a situation where there is nothing to do but wait. He prayed, which was not something he had done with any regularity or conviction since childhood, and found that, in the extremity of caring, he had resources of faith that had simply been lying dormant for lack of occasion. At 11:30, Mrs. Dowd opened the bedroom door and looked at him with an expression that told him everything was well before she spoke a word. "You have a son," she said. He stood up so fast that the chair scraped back across the floor. He was allowed in after a few minutes, and what he found was Cora propped against the pillows, pale and exhausted and radiantly, completely herself, holding a small bundle that was making small, indignant noises into the blanket. He sat on the edge of the bed and she turned the bundle toward him, and he looked at his son's face, that red, ancient, astonishing face that all new people have, furious at the cold and the light and the outrageous novelty of existing, and felt something move through him that he could not have described in 100 years of trying. "Hello," he said to his son very quietly, and his son stopped making noises for a moment and seemed to register that this was a new voice and that it was directed specifically at him, and looked at nothing in particular with the unfocused eyes of the very new. "What do we call him?" Cora asked. Her voice was tired and warm. They had discussed names as people do in a general way without fully committing, because neither of them had wanted to name someone they had not yet met. Now he looked at the small, particular, furious person in the blanket and said the name that arrived in his mind with the clean certainty of something that had been waiting. "Thomas," he said, "if you agree." He looked at Cora, who was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, and she nodded once with something profound moving behind her eyes. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." He stayed there on the edge of the bed until the lamp burned very low, holding his son, or holding his wife's hand, or simply sitting with his shoulders touching hers, while the cold pressed against the windows and the stove ticked in the kitchen, and there was no part of him that wanted to be anywhere else in the world. James discovered he had a brother at 6 in the morning, when he came out for breakfast and found his mother in bed with a visitor and his father at the kitchen stove with the deepest circles under his eyes James had probably ever seen on a grown person. "Is that the baby?" James asked, looking through the bedroom door. "That is the baby," Eli confirmed. "What is his name?" "Thomas." James considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "Thomas is a good name," he said. "Can I hold him later?" "After breakfast," Eli said. "Can I have eggs?" "Yes," Eli said, and turned to the stove and felt the particular layered happiness of a morning that contains eggs and a 7-year-old's questions and a wife asleep in the next room and a new person in the world with his grandfather's name, and thought, "This is a life. This is what a life feels like from the inside, when you stop moving through it fast enough to miss it." Thomas Carver was a loud, determined, opinionated baby who grew into a loud, determined, opinionated toddler with his mother's dark auburn hair and his father's gray eyes, and a personality that seemed to contain vast weather systems of emotion in a very small chassis. James took his role as older brother with the same grave seriousness he brought to everything, teaching Thomas the names of horses and the proper way to approach cattle, and the things he had learned about the Rocky Mountains from the book Eli had brought him 2 years earlier, which Thomas listened to with an expression of concentrated effort that suggested he was attempting to retain every word. The land continued to produce. The irrigation channel worked better than Eli had projected, and by the summer of 1882, they had expanded the cattle herd to 22 head and broken ground on a second kitchen garden on the south side of the property. They hired a hand named Vicent Navarro, younger brother, to the 2 Navarro brothers who had helped with the fence, who turned out to be diligent and cheerful, and had a particular gift with horses that Eli recognized and respected. Vicent was 22 and had come up from the Sonora region as a child with his family, one of the many Mexican families who had been settled in Nevada for generations, navigating the complicated and often unjust terrain of being brown-skinned in a territory where the law and the people who enforced it were not always consistent in how they applied their protections. Eli had seen this dynamic up close in his years of working throughout the Southwest, and he felt strongly, in the simple, clear way that some things are simply true regardless of the era in which you live them, that Vicent Navarro deserved to be treated with the same directness and respect and fair wages he would give to any man in the same position. He said this once, clearly, to a neighboring rancher who had made a comment of the sort that such men sometimes made, and the matter was closed and not reopened. Vicent stayed and was loyal, and within 2 years had become less a hired hand and more a member of the extended household, which James in particular seemed to find entirely natural. In the autumn of 1882, Cora started teaching reading and arithmetic to 3 children from neighboring properties whose parents had asked, because the schoolhouse in town was a long ride and the children were too young for it. She did this on Tuesday and Thursday mornings in the kitchen, and the kitchen table became, on those mornings, a classroom with slates and chalk, and the particular organized energy that Cora brought to teaching, which was precisely the same as the energy she brought to everything else: direct, patient, thorough, and with occasional dry humor that the children did not always understand but that Eli, passing through to get coffee, never failed to appreciate. By the following spring, there were 7 children coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and Cora had written to the County Board of Education, suggesting that the Eastern Valley warranted a proper schoolhouse of its own, and the County Board, apparently not accustomed to being written to by someone with Cora's particular combination of logical argument and persistent follow-up, had within 3 months agreed to provide the materials if the community provided the labor. Eli organized the labor. He had found, to his consistent mild surprise, that people in the valley were generally inclined to do things he suggested, possibly because he no longer suggested them from the back of a galloping horse. The schoolhouse was built over 3 weekends in June 1883, and Cora was its first and only teacher. And at the opening she stood at the front of a room of 15 children and looked out at the assembled families of the Eastern Valley with a composure that was, if you knew where to look, only very slightly undermined by the brightness in her eyes. Eli stood at the back of the room with Thomas on his hip, and James stood beside him, now 9 years old, with the expression of a young man who is very proud of his family and feels this pride as a serious responsibility. Eli put a hand on James's shoulder and James straightened slightly and did not look up, because they had an understanding by now, the kind of understanding between a father and a son that does not always require words. Thomas pointed at his mother with great authority and said, loudly, "Mama." Several people around them smiled. Eli kissed the top of his son's red auburn head. Time moved the way it moves when a person is not running ahead of it or from it, but simply inside it. Days composed themselves into seasons, seasons into years, and each one left something added and nothing of real importance subtracted. The herd grew. The irrigation brought a stretch of the eastern section that had been pure dust into something that would grow hay and support the cattle through summer without supplemental feed. Vicent took on more responsibility and eventually became the de facto foreman, a title Eli made formal one morning with a handshake, and an adjustment in wages that Vicent received with a short, dignified nod that expressed more genuine gratitude than a speech would have done. James finished the schoolhouse at 14 and went to the proper school in town, and then at 17 began to show the kind of aptitude for drawing and painting that recalled his father Thomas's talent for it. Eli and Cora sat together one evening discussing this with the careful seriousness they brought to things that mattered, and they agreed, without much debate, that if James wanted to pursue this capacity properly, he should have the opportunity. There was a teacher in Reno, a proper art teacher, trained in San Francisco, who took students, and the money could be managed if they were careful. James went to Reno and wrote letters home with the same formal seriousness he had always brought to communications, and came back for summers and holidays and was good. Thomas turned 4 and then 5 and then 6 and entered the schoolhouse his mother had built, which by 1887 was being run by a young teacher Cora had trained and who had taken over the daily instruction, freeing Cora to expand the teaching to a broader curriculum. Thomas was an enthusiastic student with more energy than the room could always comfortably contain, and his teacher wrote in her reports that he was exceptionally bright and would benefit from having somewhere to direct the considerable force of his personality. Eli read this and thought it sounded familiar. One evening in the spring of 1887, after Thomas was in bed and the house was quiet with the good particular quiet of a house in which life has been lived fully through the day, Eli found Cora on the porch in the same place she had been sitting on the evening years ago, when she had made it impossible for him to continue not saying things. He sat beside her, and the valley was in the last of the evening light, and the creek made its small constant sound, and Phantom, older now, slower, with more gray around his muzzle, but still the same in the essentials, was in the barn with Vicent's horse and the working horses and James's old pony that they had kept for reasons that were sentimental and unapologetic. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She turned to look at him. The lamplight from the window caught the edges of her face, and he thought, not for the first time, that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever stopped moving fast enough to properly see. "Was thinking," she said, "about the day you came through town at a dead gallop and nearly took my son off the boardwalk." He smiled. "And nearly knocked over your basket." "The basket is incidental," she said. "The point is I asked a man who had never slowed down for anyone to slow down, and he did." She paused. "And here we are." Here they were indeed, 40 acres that had become 60 with the purchase of the adjacent strip when it came available in 1884, a herd of 38 head, a schoolhouse. A son who was going to be an artist. A son who was going to be something he hadn't revealed yet, but that looked like it might involve either horses or the mountains or both. A life that was, by every measure he had ever thought to apply, the kind of life he had not known he was capable of until a small woman with dark eyes and no patience for unnecessary speed had made him stop and look at where he was standing. "I have been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I think," he said slowly, "that I would like to add a room to the east side of the house." He paused. "Because I think that if you and I are in agreement, it would be nice to have more room." Cora looked at him for a moment, the corner of her mouth lifted. "More room," she said. Would this have anything to do with the conversation we had last week about whether our family felt complete? "It might," he said. "I told you at the time," she said, "that I was not certain it did." "I remember," he said. "I am still not certain," she said. Then after a pause, "But I think I am leaning in a direction." He took her hand and she looked down at the plain silver ring on her finger and then back up at him with those eyes that had always told him the truth. "I love you," he said. It was not the first time he had said it. He had been saying it for years, had learned that it was one of the things he was most unambiguously right about. But she received it the same way she always did, as if it were both expected and genuinely welcome, which was exactly the right way to receive it. "I love you, Eli," she said. "I have loved you since you fixed my wagon wheel and told my son he could pat your horse's nose. I was simply waiting for you to stop moving long enough to notice." He laughed and she laughed, and in the barn Phantom shifted and stamped once, and the creek ran, and the stars came out over Harlan's Creek, Nevada, one by one, as if taking their assigned positions for the night. There was a child the following year, a girl this time, born in the warm middle of an August night, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's steady gray eyes and a temperament that suggested from the first week of her life that she had arrived with opinions and intended to act on them. They named her Eleanor, and Thomas, who had been waiting for this development with considerable interest, appointed himself her guardian with the same formal seriousness with which he approached all responsibilities. James came home from Reno that summer with 3 paintings, one of which was a large, careful rendering of the Sage Creek property as seen from the eastern ridge. The house with its white paint, the barn, the fields green with the first summer of proper irrigation success, the creek threading along the bottom of the image like a silver thread, and in the foreground, very small, a figure on a paint horse, looking out at all of it. He gave it to Eli and Cora without ceremony, leaning it against the kitchen wall one morning, and then going out to the barn as if he had simply forgotten something. And neither Eli nor Cora said anything about it to him directly, because some things in a family's life are understood in a register that is beyond words. Eli hung it beside Thomas Rourke's watercolor of the mountains and the river, and stepped back, and looked at both of them for a long time. The father who had painted mountains he would never see again, and the son who had painted a life that was still being made. He thought about the river in Thomas's painting and about the creek below the ridge, and about the way that water keeps moving, not because it is restless but because it is following the shape of the land it belongs to. He was not a man who had stopped moving. He still rode out most mornings, still covered the eastern valley with a competence and speed that surprised people who met him for the first time. He was still capable of going very fast when the situation called for it. But the gallop had a different quality, now purposeful rather than escapist, directional rather than simply forward. He had somewhere to be, and he knew where it was, and the knowing made all the difference between motion and flight. By 1889, Harlan's Creek had grown enough that it had acquired a second saloon, which the original Dusty Bell regarded with conservative disapproval, and a proper telegraph office, and a doctor, which was a development that the whole valley greeted with sincere relief. James had come back from Reno permanently, having arranged to take commissions for paintings through a gallery in San Francisco that had seen his work, and had built a small studio on the north end of the Carver property, where the light was good in the mornings. He was 20 years old now, serious and talented and quietly happy in a way that Eli recognized as the happiness of a person who has found what they are made for. Thomas, at 7, had decided with complete certainty that he intended to be the best rider in the valley. He announced this one evening at supper with the direct confidence of someone who has made a careful assessment and reached a logical conclusion. Eli looked at him across the table. Cora looked at Eli. There was a moment of shared parental communication that required no words. "You should know," Eli said to his son carefully, "that riding well is not just about going fast." Thomas considered this with the expression he had when he was paying genuine attention to something rather than simply processing it into data for later use. "What else is it?" he asked. "It's knowing when to go fast," Eli said, "and when to stop, and when to go slowly enough to see where you are and what's around you." He paused. "The best riders I've known were the ones who understood all three of those things equally, not just the fast part." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. "Did you know all three?" he asked. Eli glanced at Cora, who was watching him with that dark, steady gaze and the trace of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "I learned the other two late," Eli said honestly. "But I learned them." Thomas nodded in the manner of someone accepting a piece of information into the long-term archive. "Then I will learn them all from the beginning," he said, and returned to his supper. Cora caught Eli's eye across the table, and the smile at the corner of her mouth widened into something full and warm and complete. He had told her once, on a cold January evening in their first year of marriage, that he thought he had spent his whole life up until Harlan's Creek as a man on the outside of things, moving along the edge of other people's lives and other people's towns, too fast to be claimed by any of them. She had listened, and then said, with the gentle precision that was her particular gift, that she thought he had simply been in transit between where he started and where he was supposed to be. That the speed was not a flaw in him but a feature, that the same quality that had made him impossible to hold had, when it met the right reason to stop, made him throw himself into the stopped life with the same fullness and force he had once thrown into motion. He had thought about this for a long time afterward, turning it over in the way you turn over something that feels like a key to a lock you've been carrying for years. He was still thinking about it, in the daily ongoing way of a person who is living the truth of a thing rather than simply understanding it intellectually. He thought about it on summer mornings when he saddled Phantom, older and slower, but still magnificent, still alive in the eyes in the way of a horse that has been genuinely loved, and rode out along the creek to check the fence and the water levels and the state of the eastern pasture. He thought about it on winter evenings when the snow came down from the Sierra, and the house was warm inside, and Alina was learning to walk by pushing herself along the edge of the settle with fierce determination, and Thomas was reading at the table, and Cora was beside him with her mending or her letters or her books, and the lamp burned between them, and there was nowhere on earth he had ever been or could imagine being that was more exactly where he should be than this. He thought about it on the afternoon in the late autumn of 1889, when he rode up the lane from a morning's work, and saw Cora standing at the gate watching him come in, one hand shading her eyes, with the look on her face that she had when she was holding news that she had already turned over and resolved and was ready to share. He pulled Phantom up and swung down and walked to the gate, and she looked up at him in the amber afternoon light with her auburn hair blown loose around her face, and told him she was expecting again. He stood there with his horse's reins in his hand and his wife's face turned up to him in the light, and the creek running and the mountains to the west and the 40-acre life they had made together spreading out in every direction around them, and he did what he had learned, later than he should have but no less fully for the lateness of it to do. He slowed down. He was still. He let it reach him properly all the way in without anything held back. "How many children do you think a man needs before he starts to feel settled?" Cora asked, with that dry, warm humor that he would follow to the end of the world and back. "I'm not sure," he said. "I'm not sure I had any kind of roof over my soul before you asked me to slow down. I may be making up for lost time." She reached up and took his face in her hands, those strong, brown, capable hands, and looked at him with the steady love that was the bedrock of everything he had become since that morning outside the general store when a small woman with a navy blue dress and an enormous amount of quiet courage had stopped the most feared rider in the valley with nothing more than a clear and reasonable request. "Well," she said, "you have time now." He put his arms around her, and Phantom nosed at his shoulder with the patient affection of an old horse who has witnessed enough of his person's life to know when something important is happening. And the valley held them all in its long Nevada light, and the creek ran, and the mountains stood, and the life they had built together from that one simple, transformative moment of slowing down continued to grow, continued to open, continued to become, in the daily faithful way of all the best and truest things. Not a destination arrived at, but a road walked alongside someone whose step had finally, completely, gratefully fallen into time with your own.